The snow-covered night fell like a cold white blanket, muffling every sound of the Alaskan wilderness, leaving only the howl of the wind through pine trees and the soft crackle of firewood in the old stove of a lonely wooden cabin deep in the wild. Warren, long accustomed to such silence after years of solitude, was rarely awakened in the middle of the night. But this time, something was different. A faint, persistent sound at the front door, as gentle as the wind, yet strange enough to jolt him upright. Listening in the darkness, he heard a soft scratching. Not frantic, not chaotic, but steady, like a forgotten rhythm tapping at an old door. Mixed in was a low whimper, so faint it could have been mistaken for the breath of the winter night, yet so insistent it stirred a soft place inside the heart of a man who had grown used to being alone. Warren hastily threw on his thick wool coat, stepped barefoot onto the icy wooden floor, and cautiously approached the door. He didn't open it immediately. Living on the frozen frontier, where every shadow behind the trees might hide a hungry bear or a predator's eyes, had taught him that patience was a condition for survival. But when another whimper came, long and soaked in despair, the caution within him gave way to something else, something that makes people risk safety: compassion. He opened the door. Immediately, a gust of wind slapped his face, bringing a swirl of snowflakes into the warm room. But Warren barely noticed the cold, because right in front of him, just beyond the wooden threshold, were two creatures curled up quietly under the thick snow. Two German shepherds, shivering, huddled tightly together in heart-wrenching silence. The larger one stood in front, tall and dark-coated, matted with snow and ice, yet holding a firm stance like a pillar standing against the storm. Its ears were erect, eyes locked on Warren, not the wild, aggressive look of a feral animal, but something else entirely: calm, measured, and pleading. It didn't move forward, nor did it retreat. It simply stood there, shielding the smaller dog behind it, as if prepared to face whatever danger might come. Behind it lay the smaller one, gaunt, fur a pale silver gray, lying sideways in the snow, its hind leg stained with deep red blood, now frozen but still soaking the surrounding snow. Each breath came out in a broken mist, ragged and thin, while its dark, clear eyes stared up at him. A look drained of strength, but still holding onto a fragile hope that someone might hear. At that moment, Warren could no longer hear the wind or feel the snow. He didn't recall the old tales warning about wolves pretending to be dogs, or feral strays fleeing their packs. He only saw a creature pouring its last ounce of strength into protecting the weaker one, and a small, battered soul willing to endure the cold and pain just to sit at the doorstep of a human, hoping to be let in. He stood there, eyes locked with the larger dog, and the name Shadow surfaced in his mind like a reflex, because that piercing, gentle gaze could only belong to a soul that had endured, survived, and never backed down. The smaller one, trembling, bleeding but still obediently lying still, whispered another name into his thoughts: Hope, the fragile embodiment of a desperate wish for mercy in a merciless winter. Warren swallowed hard, hand gripping the edge of his coat. He knew opening the door to them meant inviting in two wild creatures. Nothing about that was ever taught to be safe. But what held him back wasn't fear. It was the sheer wave of emotion that rose too suddenly. It had been a long time since he saw such a look, one that begged not to die, and perhaps even longer since anyone had truly needed him. Without a word, he stepped back, letting the door swing open wider, letting the warmth from the fire spill out onto the snowy threshold. An unspoken invitation. Shadow didn't rush. It turned its head to look at Hope, gently lowered its muzzle to touch her neck, then slowly stepped through the doorway, leaving wet paw prints on the wooden floor. Hope tried to rise, her back leg quivering, letting out a soft whine, but with effort, she dragged herself through the door under her brother's watchful eye. Both came to rest by the fireplace, without barking or whimpering. They simply lay down and breathed heavily, as if, for the first time in days, they could set aside pain and fear. Warren shut the door. He said nothing. Neither did they. But in the growing firelight, in Hope's wheezing breaths and Shadow's vigilant posture, amidst the cold still seeping through the cabin's wooden cracks, something unmistakable was taking place. An unspoken pact between souls who had once lost trust and were learning, moment by moment, how to find it again. As the door closed behind them, the wind was immediately silenced, like a wave crashing against stone and vanishing into quiet. The little cabin fell into a hush almost sacred, where only the fire's pop and hiss, the ragged breathing of an exhausted animal, and the measured breaths of a man standing at the crossroads of instinct and compassion could be heard. Shadow stood in the center of the room, his tall frame casting a shadow on the wooden floor lit by firelight. His dark fur was soaked with melting snow, heavy, dripping steadily onto the floor like droplets of memory melting into the past. His eyes never left Warren, not with defiance, but with the vigilance of a guardian willing to do whatever it took to protect the only thing that mattered. Hope followed behind him, stumbling with each step. Her hind leg, now fully visible in the warm light, revealed a deep wound surrounded by fur stiffened and clumped with dried blood. She didn't cry out, only flinched, as though pain had become an old companion. When her paws reached the part of the floor that had begun to warm from the fire, her body trembled, not from cold, but from the unexpected and almost unbelievable release. She stopped just a few steps in, sniffing the scent of wood, man, and what once had been life. Then, as if unable to hold herself upright any longer, she collapsed, knees scraping against the wood, body toppling sideways in a fall that wasn't from weakness, but from permission to finally let go. Her sides heaved with each breath, her slender neck lifting slightly to gaze at the fireplace, as though she had never known such warm light could exist. Shadow turned immediately, stepping to her side, nose nudging her shoulder to check if she was still alert. He didn't lie down, just stood there, guarding her from everything unfamiliar in the room, including the man who had opened the door. Warren stepped back, slowly, silently. He lowered himself onto a stool near the fire, resting his hands on his knees, eyes never leaving the two beings before him. His heart pounded, not from fear but from something stranger creeping into his limbs, like awakening a part of himself that had long been asleep. He had seen wounded dogs before. He had once held Max, his first and only canine partner, in his arms as the dog died on the battlefield, amid gunfire and dust. But what he saw now wasn't just physical wounds. These were scars from days of hunger and frost, from memories of being chased, from a fear named human. And yet that same fear had driven them to this cabin to beg for one thing: warmth. Shadow lifted his head, locking eyes with Warren once more. In that gaze, something held him captive, not submission, not fear, but a fragile spark of trust, a silent challenge. "Are we safe here?" Warren swallowed again. He looked into those eyes and gave a small nod. No words needed. Shadow didn't move, but something in his stance softened. He turned, licked Hope's ear, then lay down, back still turned toward Warren, but no longer rigid. He rested his head on his paws, leaning just enough toward the fire for warmth, yet keeping enough distance to act if needed. The room sank back into silence. No barking, no extra motion, only the firelight dancing in Hope's gradually brightening eyes and Shadow's slower, calmer breaths, as though they were absorbing each second of peace in a world that, for once, didn't hunt them, didn't freeze them, didn't leave them behind. Warren didn't know what tomorrow would bring, nor what had led these two souls to his door. But at that moment, on the coldest night of the season, the cabin felt warmer than it had in years, not just because of the fire, but because three fragile lives were sharing a breath of survival, warmed by faith as thin as smoke, yet strong enough to spark something miraculous. Outside the cabin, the snowstorm still raged, hurling icy gusts through every gap in the forest. But inside, the silence had shifted, no longer tense, but peaceful. A fragile peace, like a thin cloth laid over an open wound. Warren sat quietly at the wooden table, his eyes fixed on the two creatures curled near the fireplace. He knew, if ever there was a moment to step deeper into the space between a man and animal, this was it. He stood slowly, so deliberately that even the floorboards beneath him barely dared to creak. From the kitchen cupboard, he took out the red meat he'd set aside for his dinner. A frozen cut of venison he'd prepped earlier in the week. He didn't hesitate. The hunger and cold those dogs had endured left no room for calculation. Some things, when shared at the right moment, speak louder than words ever could. They become unmistakable signals of trust. He sliced the meat into thin pieces. No seasoning, no cooking, just enough to be chewed and swallowed easily. When he returned to the living room, he saw Hope had already raised her head, her nose twitching gently, ears flickering in time with her breath. Though unfamiliar with the cabin, she seemed to know, instinctively, the difference between the scent of food from a human hand and danger from the world outside. Warren knelt beside the fireplace, placing the plate of meat on the floor carefully. He didn't stretch out a hand. He didn't call. He simply waited. A long pause followed, as if even time held its breath, until Hope inched forward, every movement limping, labored. Her eyes never left Warren, wary and questioning, like a child stepping away from its mother's arms, unsure what awaits. But the scent of meat was too strong, too real, too desperate, and her body far too hungry. She lowered her head, sniffed for a long moment, then took a tentative bite. She chewed slowly, not like a wild animal devouring a meal, but like she was testing the safety of it all. Even as she ate, her gaze flicked repeatedly to Warren, cautious but not hostile. It was the look of a creature betrayed too many times by humans, still trying to find one last reason to trust. Shadow stood a little way off, his posture unwavering. The scent of meat must have driven his hunger wild as well, but he didn't lunge, didn't intrude. He simply watched Hope's every movement. Only once she truly began to eat, and faced no harm from Warren, did he approach. No pushing, no growling, just a quiet presence at her side. Warren remained still, saying nothing, watching everything. He noticed how Shadow lowered himself gently, bowed his head slowly, and only took his first bite once he was certain Hope was safe. There was something in that care, a delicate balance of strength and gentleness, that struck Warren silent. Not from surprise, but from the ache in his chest, an ache that was both tender and painful, as if he were witnessing something pure in a world so used to hurt. Hope ate slowly, chewing carefully, lifting her head to check her surroundings with every swallow. Shadow, though eating faster, kept one eye trained on the space between Warren and his sister. No one spoke, yet their silent coordination played like a wordless symphony, precise, intimate, and deeply telling. Warren's throat tightened, not because they had eaten what he'd meant for himself, but because in their cautiousness, their hesitance, and their quiet harmony, he saw himself and Max, the four-legged friend who once shared battlefields with him, the dog who never touched his food until Warren did. He lowered his head, pretending to fuss with a piece of firewood in his hands, trying to push back the swell of emotion rising in his chest. Maybe, in this tiny room, on a night cut with winter's blade, it wasn't just two animals placing their first trust in a human. Maybe it was also a man, long closed off, learning for the first time to believe that love doesn't always vanish when it leaves. In the flickering firelight that danced across the dark wooden walls, Hope had finished eating. She now lay back down near the fire, eyes heavy with exhaustion, yet still sharp with awareness. Warren quietly cleaned up the plate, But his hands froze when he noticed her, that small, ragged girl, lowering her head toward her injured leg and beginning to gently lick the wound. No whimper escaped her, just slow, painful, patient motions, as if she'd lived with pain so long she no longer found it worth mentioning. That moment brought the whole room to a standstill. Warren could hear his own heart beating against old memories, long buried, now rising like mist from the ashes. Memories shaped like another dog, a name no longer spoken in the woods, yet never truly gone from his soul. Max. The sight of Hope, silently tending to her injury, struck something deep, not in the flesh, but far beneath. He remembered every detail of that final night, when Max leaped ahead of him seconds before the gunfire. In the chaos of a raid, with shouts and strobing lights, Max had charged without hesitation, just as he always had. But that night, the bullet didn't wait. Max went down, didn't cry, didn't thrash, just turned his head back to Warren with a strangely soft look, as if to say, "It's okay, I'm still here." Warren had carried him back to base, cradling that bloodied body in silence the entire night. His comrades understood. No one said a word. Max wasn't just a service dog. He was a soldier, one without a weapon, but with a heart that charged into the fire anyway. After that, Warren left the military. No farewell, no explanation. He chose the frozen wilderness, the Alaskan forest where no one asked about the past, and no one questioned the quiet sadness behind his eyes. But now, in this tiny cabin, once filled only with the sound of burning logs and his lonely breathing, the arrival of two strange dogs made the past feel alive again. Shadow, with his ever-alert stance but never a hint of aggression, reminded him of how Max once stood between Warren and danger during a street ambush. And Hope, battered, bleeding, but with eyes clear as spring water, brought back the image of Max in Warren's arms, his gaze still glowing like embers beneath the ash. Warren sat closer, not too close, not from fear, but out of respect. Respect for the space of creatures unsure how long they could trust him. He watched Hope continue to lick her wound, a motion full of instinct but gentle, almost like she was whispering to herself, "Hold on, it'll pass." Shadow looked up, meeting Warren's gaze, unmoving, but something in his eyes softened. Warren felt it immediately. He knows. No words are needed. No long stare. But Shadow understood that this man was hurting, not from the weather, but from what he had lost. And then, in the hazy warmth of the firelight and the distant moan of the storm beyond the cabin walls, Warren exhaled, not out of regret, but from a truth that felt suddenly real, that maybe, just maybe, a part of Max had never left him. Maybe Max had sent these two souls to remind him that no matter how deep the loss, the love we once gave, if it was true, never really disappears. As the flames began to dim, Warren reached for the firewood basket and tossed another log into the stove. The fire flared back to life, and at that very moment, Hope lifted her head to look at him, for the first time without suspicion, without doubt, but with a gaze long and still, as if she understood. This man, too, is learning how to lick his old wounds, slowly, silently, but with all the strength he has left to live again. The fire still burned steadily in the stove, casting a gentle warmth that crept into every wooden seam, wrapping around the three quiet forms sheltering beneath the cabin's humble roof. The small room remained still, but the silence no longer felt tense. It had softened, like a lake after a harsh wind had passed. Warren crouched beside the fireplace, watching the two animals curled close, each carrying its distinct aura. Hope, small and fragile, her wound still unhealed and crusted with blood. And Shadow, large and calm, his eyes ever alert like a silent guardian, never straying from even the slightest movement. While Hope lay on her side atop an old blanket, occasionally shifting with discomfort, Warren couldn't help but notice her hind leg. Fur darkened by dried blood and mud, twisted in a way that told him the injury was more than surface deep. When she lightly bit at her ankle and began to lick in slow, instinctive motions, Warren felt something clearer than any spoken word. She was in pain, deeply in need of care, yet trying with all her might to keep a mask of calm. He sighed softly, his eyes heavy. Then, rising quietly, he walked over to the wooden shelf by the wall, where his first aid kit sat beneath a thin layer of dust. His hand grazed its lid like it was touching a piece of memory, an object meant for his scrapes from splitting wood, now about to serve a different life entirely. As he turned around, Shadow had risen, watching his every movement with deep, probing eyes, ready to react to anything that hinted at harm. Warren understood. He, too, had once worn that same look in his early days on the battlefield, where strangers meant risk, and trust was a currency too rare to spend. He knelt beside Hope, set the kit down gently, and opened the lid with movements as steady as breathing. Not rushed, not too deliberate, just enough to keep the air around them undisturbed. Hope opened her eyes, amber brown and unsure. Her ears twitched as Warren's hand neared her leg, but she didn't pull away. That small gesture was enough for him to feel it, a fragile strand of trust being extended. When his fingers brushed through her damp fur and reached the torn skin underneath, Hope shuddered. A soft whimper escaped her, not loud, not prolonged, just a small sound, like the first ripple across a still lake from a stone, dropped gently. Feeling the pain ripple through her frail frame, Warren paused, tilting his head slightly to check Shadow's reaction. And there, in the firelight, he met a gaze stretched taut like a drawn bow, yet still. Shadow's eyes followed every move, glowing with reflection from the fire, ready to defend at the slightest misstep. Warren didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He lowered his head and continued, with the careful grace of someone untying the knots inside a wounded soul. Under his patient's hands, the mud gave way, and the wound revealed itself. Swollen, inflamed, with signs of deep trauma beneath the skin. He took ointment and applied a thin layer with soft fingers, all the while tracking Hope's breath. She didn't flee, only flinched now and then, a few harsh breaths escaping, but her body eventually eased as the first strip of bandage wrapped around her leg. And then, as Warren leaned down to secure the wrap, something unexpected happened. Shadow, still sitting by the fire, shifted his posture. He lowered his head. A slow, soft motion, but deliberate. His ears relaxed slightly, no longer pulled tight. His eyes still watched, but the intensity had faded. It wasn't surrender, nor was it full acceptance. It was something rarer, a signal, a quiet invitation from a gatekeeper, an older brother who had watched, assessed, and now chosen to step aside. Warren understood, and his heart clenched at that gesture of trust, the kind he never expected from a wild dog, especially one scarred by abandonment and survival. When the bandage was secured, Hope adjusted her position. Not fully relaxed, but she rested her head on her front paws and closed her eyes, as if her body had been touched by something gentle enough to make room for rest. Shadow laid back down too, shifting closer to the fire, his back turned slightly toward Warren now, not entirely at ease, but softer, more open. Warren remained on the floor, back against the wooden wall, hands resting on his knees, doing nothing more than watching these two lives begin to drift into sleep. In that quiet warmth, he knew something important had begun. Not through barking, not through tail wags or growls, but through a silent look. A nod from a creature who had spent his whole life learning how to protect. And in that look, for the first time, Warren didn't see a reflection of Max, but something new, something fragile, beginning to take shape in its way. As the fire in the stove faded into glowing embers, casting only the dimmest light, Warren had dozed off sitting against the wall, one arm limp, his breath slow and steady, merging with the rhythm of deep night. But not all souls inside the tiny cabin slept. One remained alert in the murky darkness of the Alaskan wilderness. Shadow stood near the door, head slightly lowered, ears upright, eyes fixed on the thin gaps where wind slipped through the worn wooden seams. He stayed there the whole night, hardly moving, occasionally turning his body slightly to scan strange noises from the distance, a dry branch snapping in the wind, snow shifting on the roof, or the faint exhale of the forest itself. No one had trained him. He bore no canine badge, but instinct made him a sentinel, honed not by drills, but by raw survival. He had heard the footsteps of hunters, smelled the breath of predators in nameless woods, and run across blood-soaked snow to protect the one thing left to him, his sister. The wind had changed tonight. It no longer came in a steady chill from the north, but in strange, broken gusts, like it was pushing something closer. Shadow sensed the shift before Warren stirred, chilled awake by the breeze sneaking through the cracks. When Warren opened his eyes, he didn't see dawn's glow. He saw the silhouette of Shadow near the door, body angled slightly toward the cabin's interior, toward Hope, still curled beneath the blanket. What stopped Warren in his tracks was the way Shadow positioned himself, using his own body to shield the smaller dog from drafts sneaking in through the gaps. It wasn't accidental. It was a choice. Conscious, protective, no whining, no pawing for comfort. Shadow stood like a living stone, resilient, unwavering, and within that silence lay all the language a human doesn't need words to understand. That responsibility, that loyalty, that devotion didn't seek praise. It didn't demand a reward. Warren sat up and pulled the wool sweater tighter around his shoulders, his gaze never leaving the scene. Part of him wanted to call Shadow back to the fire, tell him there was no need to guard like that anymore, that they were safe here. But he didn't speak. He understood that creatures who've been left behind too many times can't unlearn vigilance. They don't release their duty unless there's still something to protect. At that moment, Warren's eyes drifted to Shadow's back, where damp snow clung to thick fur, slowly soaking through. Beneath it, faint scars, old enough to fade, but still visible enough to tell a story without a voice. Then, his gaze lowered to Hope, her breath still steady, her leg wrapped with care, her face more peaceful, and the way her body leaned slightly into Shadow's soft fur told Warren that through the night, he'd never left her side. No one taught Shadow to do that. No one commanded it. But he knew, and he stayed. Warren quietly rose, stepping toward the door. Not too close to startle, just close enough to feel the bitter wind seeping through. The wind had truly shifted now. He could feel it, that broken rhythm, a harbinger of change, not just in weather, but in fate. Maybe it was a sign that something was coming, or maybe it was just a reminder. Winter here is never easy. He looked out toward the deep woods. Snow blanketed the ground. Trees bent under the weight of cold. But somewhere out there, more souls like Shadow and Hope might be wandering, still running through frozen nights in search of a door, a sliver of warmth in a world full of refusals. And when he turned back inside, Shadow finally looked at him. That gaze, neither hostile nor afraid, met Warren's with a kind of invitation, cautious but open. And in it, Warren knew. Once again he'd been allowed a little closer. These dogs hadn't spoken a word, yet they had begun telling their story in their way. And he, through his silence, had opened his heart to listen. As the pale morning light began to pierce through damp clouds after a night of bitter wind, Warren was splitting more firewood on the front porch, trying to keep the cabin's fire from dying. The wind had calmed, but the air still carried that sharp, alert kind of cold, the kind that crept into the bone and whispered that winter was far from over, and the unexpected might not yet be done. Shadow stood inside, half his body still shielding Hope, the little one still weak, though her breathing had steadied, her eyes just open enough to see Warren through the cracked door. Even indoors, Shadow didn't relax. His ears pointed outward, his muscles drawn tight like a bowstring, his eyes watching every distant shift between the pines, where mist still clung to the trees. And then, from within that quiet white, something moved. At first, Warren only heard the soft crunch of snow, not from an animal, but from a human, even paced, steady, but not rushed. He straightened and set his axe aside, eyes narrowing as a figure emerged on the snow-covered path. A tall woman in a thick parka, a wool scarf pulled high, leather gloves gripping the straps of a backpack bearing a green emblem, a dog paw within a circle, the symbol of the Arctic Wildlife Rescue Unit. She slowed when she saw Warren waiting, his hand resting loosely on the axe handle, but with no sign of tension. A gust of wind blew a dark strand of hair from beneath her hood, revealing a sun-worn face and tired, deep brown eyes, full of light. As she drew closer, she stopped, glancing past him through the cracked door. And right at that moment, Shadow stepped out. He moved to the doorway, planting himself in front, lowering his stance, gaze fixed and unblinking on the stranger. She gasped like a memory had struck her in the chest. "It's them!" Her voice rasped with emotion, her eyes glistening with something no words could fully hold. Shadow and Hope. Warren looked at her for a long moment, then stepped aside, leaving the entrance unblocked. Shadow didn't move, though the low growl in his throat seemed more warning than threat. And in that silence, the woman pulled back her hood. Her scarf fell away, revealing a face overcome with feeling. She knelt in the snow, lowering her eyes to meet Shadow's. "I'm Kara," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I've been looking for you for 2 weeks." Warren frowned. Kara stayed low, both hands open, palms pressed into the snow, as if placing herself deliberately beneath any threshold of threat. Inside the cabin, Hope had raised her head, ears flicking toward the sound of that familiar voice. "I'm a wildlife rescue specialist," Kara explained, still not looking away from Shadow. "We've been monitoring a group of German shepherds rescued from an old mining outpost. Dogs that were abandoned and survived more winters than they should have. Shadow was the oldest, the protector, the guide, and Hope the youngest, never far from her brother. They got separated from the pack during a sudden snowstorm. No GPS signal. No one thought they made it." Warren stood speechless. Shadow slowly straightened, his stance no longer as guarded. He tilted his head, sniffing at the cold air, then took one step forward, just one, like testing the shape of a memory. Kara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth square, lightly scented with antiseptic and a trace of healing balm, the familiar scent used at the center to calm and massage injured dogs. She placed it gently on the ground and stepped back. Shadow sniffed it, then flicked his ears. A small sign, but enough. And then, the miracle happened. From inside, Hope, limping but determined, stepped into the doorway. In the pale morning light, her body leaned forward, not hiding, not afraid, but taking one conscious, slow step toward the woman who once cared for her. Kara's tears spilled freely. She didn't speak. She simply knelt in the snow, hands over her face, shoulders shaking with a quiet grief too full to put into words. The dogs were alive. They had survived the wind, the cold, the edge between life and forgetting. And somehow they stood again before the human who had once been their home. Proof, more powerful than anything else, that love and patience are never wasted. Warren watched, his heart quietly aching. In the stillness of that wild land, a pulse had returned, between people, between animals once thought lost, and something more sacred than any language could say, life reborn through love. The cabin remained warm, but ever since Kara arrived, and the story of Shadow and Hope's past began to surface, a new kind of stillness settled into the wooden walls, not the stillness of wilderness or winter night, but the silence of things unspoken, of something missing finally being named. Warren poured her a cup of hot tea from the kettle he boiled each morning, placing it on the table without a word. She accepted it, wrapping both hands tightly around the cup as if trying to steady the tremble that came not from cold, but from the emotion blooming inside her. Shadow and Hope lay near her feet, not too close, but close enough to show that they recognized her scent, her voice, and the bond that once held them all together. Kara opened her backpack and pulled out a small leather document pouch. She shuffled through some wrinkled papers before stopping at an old photograph, its edges worn thin by time. In it, 3 German shepherds stood in a snowy clearing, backs touching. One was tall and strong, ears upright like twin antennas. Shadow. The second, smaller, with a hesitant gaze but a lifted chin. Hope. And nestled between them, the smallest pup. Floppy ears, curled tail, mischievous eyes, mouth open mid-pant as she'd just finished a wild chase. Her name was Echo. We called them the Echo Line, Kara said with a soft, bittersweet smile. The 3 were inseparable. Wherever one went, the others followed. Shadow always led. Hope clung close to her big brother. And Echo, she was the spark. The echo that reminded the whole pack they were still alive. Warren stared at the photo. Something brushed his heart. Not just the image, but the way Kara spoke of them. As if those dogs were part of a sacred memory. Not only for her, but for all who'd witnessed the bond between human and voiceless souls. 4 months ago, she continued, when the whiteout hit, our team was tracking the pack near the Eastern Valley. All signals went dead. We lost contact with Shadow, Hope, and Echo after a minor avalanche on the northern slope. When we finally got there, we only found 2 sets of tracks, one large, one small, heading into the forest. The rest. She stopped. Her eyes drifted from Warren to Shadow. He had lifted his head, eyes wide open, not blinking. Heat rose gently from his thick coat, and in that gaze was something beyond explanation. Like he was listening, remembering, and also grieving. Echo left no trace, Kara whispered. We think she was buried under the snow. The team dug for 10 hours, found nothing, only white space and cold that ate at even our faith. Warren inhaled deeply. How old was she? Kara ran her fingers gently across the photo. Not yet 2. Still a pup, but sharp, fast, and so in need of protection. Shadow always wrapped around them both when the wind changed. At those words, Hope stirred beneath the blanket. She sniffed the air and turned toward the door, ears shifting like she had caught a distant signal. Shadow immediately rose, stepping close, lowering his body to shield her, a habit rooted too deeply to forget. Kara held her breath. They heard her name, she whispered, or maybe they never stopped hearing it. Warren stepped toward the table, slowly, leaning in to look at Shadow. Their eyes met, not like man and dog, but like 2 beings who understood the same truth, that what remained wasn't yet enough to be called peace. Do you think, he said softly, Echo might still be alive out there? Kara didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the foggy window, where the wind had begun to shift again. We once believed there was no hope left, she said. But this morning, seeing Shadow and Hope alive, I'm no longer sure what's impossible. Shadow stepped closer to the table, his nose touching the edge of the old photograph. No whine, no bark, but when the firelight flickered across his eyes, something shimmered, like a memory waking from a long sleep beneath the snow. The cabin had long since grown warm, but it wasn't the fire that changed the air. It was the moment Shadow stepped forward and gently laid his head across Warren's leg that turned the room into something else entirely, a silence no longer shaped by emptiness, but by trust, a stillness steeped in feeling, born from something unspoken between a man and a dog once lost to the wild. Warren stayed perfectly still. His hands, rough from years of solitude and splitting wood, suddenly felt clumsy as he rested one gently on Shadow's thick coat. He didn't stroke, didn't pet, because this wasn't about soothing, and Shadow didn't need comfort, All he needed was a presence. And in that moment, that was enough. For the first time since Max, his loyal K9 partner, had died in his arms, Warren let another dog that close. In the corner of the room, Hope still slept, curled in the blanket Warren had carefully laid over her. Her wound had been cleaned and rebandaged for the last time that day. And somehow, Shadow's presence beside her offered more relief than any painkiller ever could. She didn't twitch in her sleep, didn't whimper, just breathed evenly, as though, for the first time since being lost in the snow, she had found a full night's rest. Kara sat across the fire, still holding a now cold mug of tea. She didn't intrude on the moment between Warren and Shadow. Having witnessed countless rescues, savage dogs, wild wolves that could snap steel, she knew. Moments like this couldn't be forced or taught. They happened only when two beings pulled in their claws, lowered their defenses, and allowed their loneliness to be filled by someone else, man or dog. Warren shifted gently, lifting his free hand to tug a knit blanket across Shadow's back. He didn't meet the dog's eyes, but he could feel the slow, contented breath escaping Shadow's nose. It wasn't the breath of a creature being protected. It was the exhale of a guardian, finally allowing himself to rest. "They've always been like that," Kara said softly, voice dropping like she feared breaking something delicate. "Shadow once took a brutal hit protecting Hope from a pack. Got torn up badly but still stood his ground until she got away." Warren wasn't surprised. He didn't need detailed stories to understand Shadow. He had seen it in the way the dog watched over his sister, in how he only ate once Hope was comfortable, in his hyper-awareness of every sound outside, but never once growling at the man who'd slowly earned his way into their trust. Shadow wasn't just a survivor. He was a soul guarding the most precious thing in his world. "Tomorrow," Warren said, barely above a whisper, "we leave early. The wind might shift by noon." Kara nodded. "I've contacted the center. They're prepping a special pen and the vet's already on standby." Warren was quiet a moment, then added, "I'll drive the sled down the east trail. I know every turn, but one stretch is heavy with snow. We'll have to go slow." Shadow didn't move. His head remained on Warren's leg, his body still but listening. And Hope, perhaps sensing the plan in her sleep, shifted slightly, then went still again. In her dreams, maybe she knew that by morning, they'd leave the place that had saved them. A cabin cold in structure, but warm in every way they needed. Kara rose and moved quietly to check Hope's bandage one last time. She knelt and whispered something into the dog's ear, something so soft no one could hear it. But whatever it was, Hope's body seemed to ease at the sound. Warren watched, a subtle ache blooming in his chest, that bittersweet knowing that something beautiful was ending, or maybe just beginning in a way they couldn't yet keep. That night, Warren didn't go to bed. He stayed seated in the wooden chair, hand resting on Shadow's back, eyes on the flickering fire as it burned its final flame. In that last quiet night, he let the memories of Max fade further back, making room for Hope sleeping peacefully, and for Shadow, the gatekeeper, now letting a piece of his heart settle next to a man who was no longer a stranger. And he understood. Tomorrow, when they left this cabin, everything would change. But tonight, in this fragile peace they had found, they were already a family. When the pale light of dawn glimmered through snow-laced branches, sparkling off the ice crusting the cabin's porch, Warren was already awake. It wasn't sound that roused him, but a stillness, a particular quiet that only someone who had lived in the forest long enough would understand. On the edge of morning, something in the air had shifted. Their time together in the wooden shelter was coming to an end. Shadow still lay beside Hope, but his ears were already upright, eyes open and alert, fixed on the door as if waiting for departure. There was no urgency in his gaze, only calm acceptance, as if he knew his mission here had ended, and now it was time to move forward, to take his sister somewhere they might heal, and maybe, just maybe, find what had once been lost. Warren stepped outside, inspecting the old sled one last time, the one he'd kept like a relic. Its wooden frame held firm. The pull ropes were solid. The motor had been tested the day before. He brushed off a thin layer of frost and added extra blankets into the sled's back compartment, shaping a small nest for Hope to ride gently through the bumpy forest trail. Kara helped Warren lift Hope into the sled. She let out a soft whine, lips trembling but didn't resist. Some part of her knew the hands lifting her meant safety. Shadow climbed in afterward, not needing a command. He moved slowly but surely, wrapping himself around Hope like a shield, body curled along her side, eyes forward like a sentinel. "He doesn't need a leash," Kara said softly. "As long as Hope is in that sled, he won't leave her." Warren nodded, adjusted the controls, and the sled began to move. The soft hum of the motor echoed briefly across the whitened woods, then melted into the falling snow, which had begun to drift down again. The trail led east, winding through soft slopes and tall pines bowed under fresh snow. It was one of Warren's oldest paths, the one he had taken with Max during long-ago training runs. Today, he rode it with two wild souls, wounded, but fiercely alive. Hope whimpered now and then when the sled hit a rough patch. Each time Shadow would shift, using his shoulder to counter the jolt, steadying the sled's frame so no shock touched his sister. Every move was precise and intentional. Warren gripped the handlebars tighter, not from fear, but from the deep weight of emotion. He had seen loyalty before, but never like this, not without command, not without words. Just one steady gaze, one silent body always ready to take the blow. Kara rode behind, clutching the radio, speaking into it between patches of static. "We're stable," she reported. "Leaving the cabin, reaching the tree line. Estimated arrival at rendezvous in 2 hours." Snow thickened. The wind began weaving through the treetops, whistling high and sharp, the sound of a storm thinking about returning. Warren pressed forward, eyes scanning the trail. But the deeper they went, the more he sensed something off. No birds, no branches cracking, no scurrying from small animals. The forest had gone silent. Shadow sensed it too. His ears rose higher, head lifting, eyes narrowing toward a point in the snow-draped woods ahead. Hope stirred, let out a faint cry, and Shadow turned to lick her ear gently, then stared forward again, sharper now. "There's something ahead," Warren murmured. "I feel it too," Kara whispered back. "Might be deer, might be something else." And then Warren saw it, a flicker of movement between two trees, a shadow. It passed swiftly and vanished, no sound, no scent, just a presence, the sense of something watching. He slowed the sled. "Hold on," he said to Kara. "We're stopping." The sled coasted to a halt in snow deep enough to bury a knee. The wind howled louder. Warren stepped off, eyes fixed on the place where the figure had passed. Shadow stood abruptly in the sled, body taut like a drawn bow, but silent. Hope stirred, eyes cloudy but suddenly bright, locked in the same direction as her brother. Something was coming. And Warren understood. This wasn't a threat. It was a return. Snow kept falling steadily as Warren brought the sled to a stop on the white-covered slope. The entire forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something about to unfold. Kara crouched beside Hope, adjusting the bandages on her leg, while Warren listened closely, not to any loud noise, but to the subtle, layered movements only someone who'd lived in the wild long enough could decipher. Then, the radio clipped to Kara's shoulder crackled softly, followed by Dan's voice, faint and carried on the wind. "We've got fresh tracks at the northern edge of the forest. Small paws, likely a lone dog. Looks like it's been traveling alone." The message cut through the tension, like a blade through the taut fabric. Kara and Warren exchanged a glance. No words needed. They both knew what came to mind instantly. Echo. "It's Echo," Warren murmured, eyes locking on the northern tree line. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but because a glimmer of hope had flared up in a landscape that had nearly accepted despair. "You're going after it?" Kara asked, though the answer was written all over him. Warren gave a small nod, then turned toward Shadow. The large shepherd was already standing in the sled, eyes fixed on the distant woods, on something unspoken but deeply known. Without needing a signal, Shadow stepped down into the snow, facing Warren directly. No bark, no wasted motion. Shadow lifted his head and howled. It wasn't a warning, not aggression. It was a call, low and resonant, made of blood and memory. The sound rippled through the forest, weaving between icy trees, skimming across the snow like an invisible wave. Even Warren froze at the sound. He had never heard anything like it, a howl carrying so much emotion it seemed to pull time backward, as if it might reach wherever Echo was now. Hope stirred, ears twitching, lifting her head. Warren knelt to stroke her gently, then turned to Shadow. "I'll bring it back," he promised. He carried only a small pack, some first aid supplies, a bag of dried meat, a flashlight, his old hunting knife, and a handheld radio. Before setting off, he tucked the blanket around Hope again and patted Shadow's side. Part reassurance, part vow. Beneath his thick coat, his heart beat hard, but his steps on the snow were steady. Some journeys didn't need certainty, just belief. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the world fell away. The trees stood like stone sentinels beneath their coats of frost, and his footprints became the only mark upon the untouched white. Snow rose to mid-calf, damp and biting, but Warren moved slowly, scanning the ground for the prints Dan had mentioned. And finally, he saw them. Small paw prints, sharp, staggered, drifting side to side. In some places, the tracks dragged as though the animal had limped, exhausted, and near the edge of one print, the snow hadn't yet sealed itself. Fresh. Warren held his breath. He moved quietly a few steps forward, then saw it. Behind the broken trunk of a pine, a small figure appeared. Echo. Smaller than both Shadow and Hope. Her once dark coat was faded and matted with ice and dirt. Her body was thin, one leg tucked up and limp. Her head hung low, eyes half-lidded but alert. She didn't run, she didn't bark, she just watched. And when Warren knelt and said nothing, the space between them finally became visible. One side was man, the other survival, divided by wounds deeper than winter's teeth. Warren slowly opened the bag of meat, set it on the snow, and backed away. Hands open, no threat. "Hey, little one," he murmured. "Your brother's waiting. Hope's waiting. Can you take a few more steps?" Echo froze. Her nose twitched. She smelled the food, yes, but also something else. The scent of human warmth, pinewood smoke, and the memory of sleeping with her siblings curled beside her. She blinked, licked her lips, and took a step, and then another. When she was just within reach, Warren extended his hand. Echo paused, gave a faint whine, not fear, but pain, and then, gently, pressed her nose into his palm. In that small, trembling touch, Warren felt the world shift, like a spark reigniting in long-dead coals, a breath of life returning to something frozen. "Good girl," he whispered, and carefully lifted her into his arms. Underneath her patchy, freezing coat, she was feather-light, fragile as old paper. But Echo didn't resist. She simply leaned her head against his chest, breathing out a long, tired sigh, as if she knew she was finally being led home. And in the white hush of the woods, Warren began the walk back, with Echo in his arms, and the promise warming his chilled fingers. This family will be whole again. The dark gray sky cast a chilling veil over the forest as Warren retraced the path he had taken before, this time with Echo in his arms. The little dog felt like nothing more than a faint breath clinging to life amid a white, silent world. Snow was still falling. Not a storm, but steady, like cold whispers from the earth and sky, dusting his shoulders, settling on Echo's drooping ears, and tracing the winding footprints he was following back to the waiting camp. Not far ahead, Kara stood at the edge of the tent, eyes scanning every pale patch of white for Warren's silhouette. She still couldn't believe what she had heard over the radio, that Warren had found a third dog. But when she finally saw him in the distance, walking slowly with his head down, cradling something like it was priceless, she ran, without hesitation. "You found him?" Her voice broke with emotion. Warren didn't answer right away. He only bowed his head slightly, arms still wrapped tightly around Echo, now swaddled in a snow-dampened blanket. The small body in his arms was growing warmer, not from circulation, but from the heat his own body was giving, clinging to the last sparks of life. "He's alive," Warren whispered, as if even speaking too loudly might break the spell. He laid Echo gently on a blanket, already spread inside the tent. Kara knelt beside them, brushing back Echo's tangled fur to check his breath, then pressed her fingers lightly against the faint pulse in his neck. "His heart's still beating, but it's very weak," she said quietly. He pushed himself way beyond his limits. And then, in that still moment, a soft sound rose. A low, gentle howl, an answer from the other side of the tent. Shadow. The big dog shot to his feet, waiting for no command. He had caught the familiar scent long before Echo was set down. His strong head lifted, ears perked into the wind as if listening for a long-lost melody. Without a bark, he stepped forward. Slow, steady, deliberate, and bowed his head low, touching his nose gently to Echo's forehead. Warren froze. Hope stirred, even with her legs still bandaged. She leaned sideways, eyes opening as the sound reached her, and in that instant they lit up, soft and full of aching sweetness. She stretched her neck just enough to press her head lightly to her sibling's side, then lay back, exhaling as if a missing piece of her had just returned after days lost in the snow. Now 3 bodies touched, huddled close like a small fire in the winter cold, not fierce, but persistent, not loud, but deeply felt. Warren knelt beside them, his eyes fixed on the dogs. What he witnessed wasn't just a reunion, it was something far greater, the rebirth of a family, in the quiet, noble form of dogs. Kara whispered, "His name is Echo, isn't it?" Warren nodded, as if only hearing someone else say the name aloud made it real. Echo remained still, but in his eyes, for the first time after countless days of loneliness in the wild, there was a flicker, a faint spark, a sign that he no longer felt alone. Warren placed his hand on Shadow's back. The hand was rough, the hand of a man who had locked his heart away after an unspeakable loss. But now, with these 3 fragile beings before him, the ice inside him was slowly beginning to melt. "This family," he said softly, "is whole again." Outside, the snow continued to fall, but the wind had calmed. Inside the makeshift shelter, where the firelight shimmered in the wet eyes of 3 dogs nestled against each other, Warren, for the first time, understood what it meant to feel complete. As the tent flap rustled open to let Warren in, a gust of cold wind followed him, carrying the scent of snow, forest soil, and something more subtle that spread quietly through the air. An invisible signal, unspoken but instantly felt by the heart. Shadow, who had been lying motionless beside Hope like a silent night guard, suddenly sprang up, not from sound or light, but from the arrival of a scent he knew by heart. There was no growl, no bark, no sprint. The big dog simply stood still, head raised, ears pointed towards the tent's entrance as if someone far away were whispering his name. And then, in the stillness, a long, deep howl broke free, rising to the tent's roof and echoing into the soul like a note filled with something beyond words. Hope stirred awake. Though her legs were weak and her vision still blurred by pain, she raised her head, her trembling nose searching the breeze. Her brown eyes widened, brimming with tears, the kind of emotion only possible when one soul touches another, When something once lost finds its way back. No one taught them how to recognize each other. There were no calls, no photos, no food scents, only instinct and the faint trace of hope. But Shadow and Hope knew. Echo was home. Warren entered, cradling Echo in both arms. The thick blanket still wrapped around the frail pup, only his damp nose and drooping ears visible through exhaustion. Under the fire's dim glow, Echo looked like a fragment of ash rekindled. Small, curled from the cold, yet with a heart still beating. Faint, but unyielding. Shadow stepped forward. His gait was steady, but there was hesitation. A lump of emotion held back. He didn't charge like dogs do when reunited. Instead, he moved quietly, stopping just an arm's reach from Warren. His eyes held both darkness and light. And then, for the first time since they'd entered the cabin, Warren saw Shadow lower himself. Not out of fear, but out of love. The black nose gently touched the edge of the blanket where Echo lay. Shadow let out a soft whimper. Barely audible, meant only for the pup. Echo hadn't opened his eyes yet, but Warren could feel him stir slightly, nudging toward the familiar scent. A faint whine escaped Echo's throat, thin as mist, yet enough to bring tears flooding Hope's eyes. She moved forward too, despite the pain still wrapped around her injured leg. Every step made her tendons tighten, but Hope did not stop. She halted beside Shadow, not pushing ahead, only lowering her head before gently licking Echo's ear. A gesture not rushed, but tender, like a mother comforting her child after a nightmare. Echo flinched lightly, then tilted his head. His eyes opened fully. For a moment, both Warren and Kara held their breath. The three dogs lay close. No words needed, no human language. The invisible bond had reformed, not just through memory, but through blood, through breath once shared in winters past, in hunts, in play, in sleep beneath the same old pine. Echo was no longer alone. His pack, his family, was here. Kara bent down, eyes wet. "They remember each other in ways we'll never understand," she said, voice hoarse. "No calls, no pictures, no food, just instinct and a little hope, and they find their way back." Warren gently stroked Echo's back. The matted fur warming under his hand made his chest tighten. Not from sorrow, but from a quiet flood of gratitude. He hadn't just saved a dog. He'd helped a family come back together. That night, the camp grew quiet like a chapel. The three dogs curled together, breathing evenly in their first real sleep after endless days of cold and waiting. Shadow lay on the outside, eyes still open like a night watchman, though no longer tense. Hope nestled in the middle, and Echo, the smallest, was wrapped between them like the warm core of a cocoon reborn. Outside, the wind shifted. Warren looked up at the sky and saw clouds thickening and the moon beginning to fade. He knew the trials weren't over. But now, he no longer felt alone. Because here, deep in the wilderness, faith had returned, shaped like three German shepherds, carrying the breath of family, memory, and a hope that never died. Outside the camp, snow still fell steadily, and the wind swept through the trees, creating whispers in the forest like voices from the old woods. But inside the thin canvas of the makeshift tent, time seemed to stop. Everyone, Warren, Kara, Dan, and Na, stood to the side, eyes fixed on the three figures slowly coming together like the final pieces of a puzzle once shattered by the storm. Warren gently placed Echo near the small fire. The flames flickered, casting a fragile warmth that began to melt the layer of frost on Echo's gray coat. The first drops of meltwater looked like tears, the kind Echo had no strength left to shed through the long days of cold, hunger, and solitude. Without a word, Shadow, the calm and responsible elder, stood up, though his muscles were still taut from a night guarding hope. There was something new in his eyes. In the firelight, Warren could see it. A flash deep in Shadow's gaze, the light of recognition, of absolute belief in something that could only be described as a miracle. Shadow moved toward Echo with slow, deliberate steps, as if afraid even a little too much force might shatter the fragile life before him. When he reached him, there was no bark, no howl, no pounce. He simply lowered his head and pressed his nose to Echo's forehead, a silent touch filled with memory, love, and the bond etched into their blood. Hope, still resting in the corner of the tent, heard the sound of a third breath, caught the scent she'd once known, and felt Shadow's heartbeat anew. All of it awakened something primal inside her. She struggled to her feet, her hind leg trembling and aching. Each step toward Echo was a defiance of pain, a movement driven by need, to touch him, to know that their long search hadn't been in vain. When she reached him, she bowed low and slowly licked Echo's shoulder, soothing, comforting, saying in the language of dogs, "We're here. You're not alone anymore." Echo didn't move much. He only curled slightly, then tilted his head to look at his brother and sister. In his eyes, clouded by snow and fatigue, yet still glimmering, was a flicker of doubt that slowly gave way to relief. He exhaled, his lower lip trembling, and inched forward to rest his head against Shadow's chest. Instantly, the big dog lay down, opening his body like a winter cloak, shielding Echo from everything that had tried to take him. Hope lay down too, folding into the embrace, completing a perfect circle. 3 bodies layered gently, seamless, soft, as if the snow had never torn them apart, as if every wound could be healed in each other's warmth. The silence inside the tent no longer felt heavy, but sacred. No one spoke. Kara quietly wiped her eyes. Dan stood still as stone, and Na gently squeezed Warren's hand with quiet admiration. Warren never looked away from the dogs, his chest swelling with something he thought he'd lost forever, a sense that something truly right had unfolded in the world. Not out of gain, not out of instinct to survive, but out of love. A love that needed no words, no human guidance, yet stronger than any vow. A family reunited, not by blood as humans define it, but by the invisible thread of loyalty, memory, and the will to live together. Shadow glanced at Warren. The look was no longer wary. It was gentle, sincere, and grateful, a deep acknowledgement from a once wild creature who had learned to trust. Warren sat down slowly, careful not to disturb the sacred bond before him. He said nothing, but in his heart, a whisper rose. "Max, if you were here, you'd understand. I'm not alone anymore." The sky lightened after a freezing night, and dawn painted the snow a pale yellow hue. Quiet, like a whispered consolation for those who had survived the storm. Inside the temporary shelter, the fire still burned, spreading warmth throughout the space. But it was the steady breathing of the 3 dogs curled up together that gave Warren a true sense of hope in life. Shadow lay close to Hope and Echo, eyes half closed but ears still perked, as if unable to fully trust in the calm. Warren stood nearby, lifting the kettle from the rack above the campfire, preparing tea. Kara was jotting down quick observations in her small notebook. Dan and Na were outside, resetting a few tent stakes that had been knocked loose by the night winds. No one expected the peace to be shattered by the sound of unfamiliar footsteps, heavy, slow, and deliberate, approaching from the edge of the camp. Warren raised his head, squinting from habit, an instinct shaped by years of life in the deep woods, where the sound came before sight in moments of danger. And then he saw him, Ben Halverson, the former neighbor who once lived a slope away from his cabin, now relocated to town, but still carrying the rigid mindset of someone ruled by fear. "Warren," Ben said. His voice was dry and cold, like winter wind. "I heard you're harboring wild dogs here. Have you lost your mind?" Before Warren could answer, Shadow raised his head. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply stood and positioned himself between Hope and Echo, eyes sharpening like a reflection of threat. Hope lifted her head. Echo stirred but remained weak. The air suddenly tightened, like a violin string pulled to the edge of snapping. "I've informed the ranger service," Ben said, tossing a glance past the tent, then back at Warren. "By wildlife control regulations, if these animals are deemed dangerous or unregistered, you know what happens next." Kara stepped forward, cool but courteous. "They're not wild dogs. They're Shadow, Hope, and Echo. 3 German shepherds part of a North Ridge Wildlife Conservation Tracking Project. I've been their direct supervisor since last year." Ben furrowed his brow, eyes flickering with both doubt and tension. "I don't care what names you give them. I know these animals have attacked people before, made the town call emergency meetings, and now you've brought them back near residents, in an unsecured camp?" Warren stepped between Ben and Kara. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of calm born from someone who's experienced loss and won't let it happen again. "I didn't bring them back," he said. "They found me. On a night so cold even people could barely move under blankets. They didn't growl, didn't bark. They tapped at my door like they were asking for help, and I couldn't close that door." Ben's eyes narrowed. "You're risking everyone here over an emotional decision." "It's not emotional," Warren said, his voice low. "It's conscience." Kara glanced sideways at Warren, surprised. Dan and Na stopped what they were doing and silently moved to stand behind him. A quiet display of solidarity. Ben remained rigid. He pointed at the tent. "They look dangerous. Do you see the big one's eyes? I take one more step and it'll leap at me." Shadow stepped forward once. No growl, no bark, just a more upright stance, as if he too were weighing whether to trust the man in front of him. Then, as if sensing the tension, Warren turned and gently placed a hand on Shadow's neck. Not holding, just touching. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, Shadow lowered his head slightly, his gaze softening, as if to say, "If you trust him, I will too." Kara pulled out documents, photos and GPS tracking logs. Her voice was firm and professional, and each word was chosen with precision. "We accept full responsibility. All necessary paperwork has been filed with the Ranger Service. These dogs have IDs, histories, and legitimate reasons to be protected and treated. You have no legal authority to decide their fate." Ben gripped the strap of the rifle slung across his back, but his eyes then met Hope's. And in them, a faint light, unclear whether it came from the fire or tears. He paused, as if, for a moment, he too saw something undeniable. "I'll wait for the Rangers," he said. "But if they decide as I expect, no one's stopping them." He turned slowly and walked away without another word. When his silhouette disappeared behind the pines, Warren finally exhaled. Shadow stepped down from his guard position and returned to lie beside Hope and Echo. The big dog made no grand gesture, just laid his head on his little sister's paws, as if nothing had happened. And as Warren looked at them, he knew. The reason he stepped forward today wasn't just compassion. It was the truth that for the first time in years of solitude, he had something to protect. And it was lying curled together in the tent. 3 heartbeats, 1 family. Dusk had just begun to fall, the last light of day fading behind the snow-covered peaks, when a strange wind swept through the pine trees surrounding the camp. It was unlike any Warren had heard before, hovering on the edge between the forest's sigh and a silent warning rising from the earth itself. He looked up and saw thick clouds churning from the horizon, pulling a brooding grayness across the northern sky. "We've got a storm coming," Kara murmured, almost to herself. She stood silently beside Warren, both of them staring at the wind-swirling broken branches into chaotic spirals at the base of the slope. No one needed confirmation. Dan and Na immediately split up to reinforce the tent ropes. Warren rushed straight toward the small shelter where the dogs were resting. Each footstep sank deep into the fresh snow, the sound of the tarp whipping under the growing gusts echoing behind him. Inside, Hope was curled under a lined blanket, her breath uneven. One of her ears drooped, trembling each time the wind slipped through the seams. Echo was still asleep, head resting on Hope's shoulder, occasionally letting out soft whimpers. Shadow, like a living statue, sat by the flap, eyes fixed outward, ears alert to every shift in the wild. "We don't have much time," Warren muttered, feeling the fabric stiffen under his hands as the cold seeped through. And then the storm hit, without warning, without mercy. A violent gust tore through the auxiliary tent roof, ripping with a sound that shattered the silence. The canvas whipped into the air, entangling the anchor poles like a lost kite. Wind blasted through every gap, hurling snow into the shelter, forcing everyone to shield their faces and retreat. The radio fell. The signal light died. Contact with the outside was gone. Warren dropped to his knees beside Hope. She trembled uncontrollably, her small body nearly frozen. Without hesitation, he tore off his thickest coat, wrapping her in it, trying to help the icy fur absorb the last warmth he could offer. Kara handed him their last dry blanket, the one meant for human use in emergencies. But now, they all understood. These lives needed it more. Echo was lifted into Warren's arms, swaddled in a scarf around his neck and shoulders. The little dog remained asleep, breathing short and shallow, his tiny chest heaving as if struggling to hold back the cold, pressing in on the edge of life. Shadow still hadn't moved from the entrance, where the wind howled and snow slammed like waves. His face was covered in frost, ears pinned back, his posture sagging. But when Warren gave a soft pat on his back and gestured inside, Shadow turned, locking eyes with him. Not asking permission, not doubting, just acknowledging. Then he stepped in, lying down against the outermost edge of his siblings, a final barrier between the storm and the fragile warmth within. Kara unwrapped her scarf for Echo. Dan peeled off his thin sweater and tucked it under Shadow's belly for insulation. Na collected torn canvas scraps, quickly rigging a snow shield with rope and sticks. Everyone worked in silence. No one complained. The wind screamed outside, but inside something stayed warm. Warren pulled the 3 dogs close to the fire. He sat among them, his hand resting on Hope's neck, gently stroking as he monitored her breath. Across from him, Echo tilted his head slightly toward the warmth, and in the haze of his dream, the little dog seemed to recognize a once-distant embrace. Warren's hand gripped the corner of the blanket, fingers beginning to numb. He looked at Shadow, the big dog anchoring the group with each steady breath. His thick fur was tangled from the wind, but his eyes never left Warren's. "I let a friend die once in cold like this," Warren whispered, his voice cracking from the frozen air in his throat. "Max, I could have done more." Shadow shuddered, maybe from the wind, maybe because he sensed something in Warren's voice, a guilt long buried. Hope's breathing steadied. Her chest rose and fell beneath Warren's hand. Echo let out a breath, light as mist in the rare calm between howls. Outside, the storm didn't stop. Snow fell sideways, piling on the roof. But inside the shelter, where humans and dogs huddled together, a small fire still burned. And in its flickering light, Warren, once closed off by a loss too heavy to name, felt his heart beat again. Not from fear, but from hope. The storm receded behind the mountain ridge like a beast that had eaten its fill, leaving only fitful winds and a sky burdened with clouds. But instead of relief, Warren felt like a stone had settled in his chest. Everyone at camp was drained after the long, tense night. The fire had dwindled, reduced to a few glowing embers among half-burned logs. Shadow hadn't slept. The large dog kept watch beside a narrow gap at the tent's edge, his massive frame casting a silent shield over his younger siblings. His ears stood erect, swiveling toward the forest. Though the wind had died, something else, quieter but heavier, was moving in the still cold. Warren couldn't sleep either. Years in the military had sharpened instincts that now whispered something wasn't right. He rose and moved quietly through the camp, scanning every corner. The moon had emerged through thinning clouds, casting a silvery sheen across the snow. Then Shadow froze. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not loud, not aggressive, but enough to freeze the air. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Warren narrowed his eyes, following Shadow's gaze. Amid the blotchy white of snowdrifts, a dark shape moved. Slowly, cautiously. Its head was low, gait uneven, fur ragged and windblown. A stray dog, or something that used to be one. Now it was the embodiment of despair. Gaunt, glassy-eyed, its body streaked with dried blood and frost. Kara saw it, too. She stood without grabbing a weapon, only her instincts on full alert. No panic. No retreat. She took a few quiet steps forward, placing herself between the animal and the 3 resting dogs. "Step back," she said softly, to both Warren and herself. The stray halted. Its eyes shimmered in the dark, catching the ember light like 2 flickers of coal. Its lips curled, baring yellowed teeth, less in threat than in desperation. Whether it was wounded or starving, the tension made it dangerously unpredictable. Shadow stepped forward, slow but sure. No barking, no dramatic growl, just a clear, unwavering stance, placing himself squarely between Hope, Echo, and the intruder. His body said everything. "Come closer, and I will not yield." Warren quickly grabbed a partially burning stick from the fire. The tip glowed orange in the dark. He raised it, hand steady, and shook it slightly toward the animal. "Go," he said, his voice low and even, like wind through trees. The stray backed up. The wind lifted its fur, revealing raw patches where skin showed through. Perhaps bitten, perhaps simply ravaged by snow and starvation. It let out a faint whine, not of menace, but of exhaustion meeting the wall of fear. Kara kept her eyes on it. She crouched slowly, her voice firm but gentle. "Go, we won't hurt you. But you can't hurt anyone here." The dog hesitated. Its legs buckled and it sank into the snow. But after a second, perhaps realizing it wasn't welcome, it pushed itself up, staggered, and turned back into the forest's shadows. No one said a word. Only the sound of Shadow's breathing, easing now that the figure had vanished between the trees. Warren glanced around the camp. His eyes landed on the 2 younger dogs still asleep. Hope snuggled against Echo, and Echo, though still weak, nuzzled into his siblings as if dreaming of safety. Shadow returned quietly, and for the first time since the storm broke, laid beside Hope, curling his tail around her, his eyes still open and watchful. No one slept for the rest of the night. Though the fire had been stoked again and the wind had calmed, the encounter had left everyone on edge. Not out of fear of attack, but because the black shadow in the snow was a stark reminder. Nature spared no one, and the line between life and death was thinner than the canvas above their heads. And yet, in the tension, something new took root. Trust. Shadow, the silent dog who always kept his distance, had risen to protect. Not just his siblings, but the humans who had reached out to him. And in that moment, Warren felt it. Something was changing. In the snow and darkness, a wordless bond had begun to form. A small but persistent flame in a heart he thought had long since gone cold. The next morning, sunlight didn't banish the cold, but at least it brought some light after a heavy night. The sky was painfully clear, revealing snowbanks piled high like stone walls around the temporary camp. In the lingering scent of damp smoke and cold ashes, Warren noticed something odd. Kara was sitting motionless by the tent wall, her shoulder slumped, left hand gripping the collar of her jacket, face ghostly pale. "Kara," he said quietly, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" She didn't respond right away, only gave a small nod as he sat beside her. A soft breeze carried flakes of broken ice like mist, making the moment feel fragile, almost unreal. "Tree fell at midnight," she murmured, voice barely a breath. "Think it hit my shoulder." Warren gently took her hand, and then quickly checked the injury. Her right shoulder was badly swollen. Beneath the thick jacket, the skin burned hot and purple. He removed his outer coat, folded it to support her back. and silently pulled out the first aid kit from his pack. Kara didn't cry out, but Warren noticed her sharp breaths, the way her jaw clenched every time he shifted her arm to wrap it. Her silence wasn't stoicism. It was a habit, as if she had long learned to bury her pain deep inside. "I was late once," she said suddenly, eyes fixed on the wide expanse of snow at the camp's edge. "A small husky caught in a trap. When I got there, all I found was a trail of frozen blood. Maybe it waited for me." Warren paused, his hands still. He didn't need to ask more. The story was like shattered glass. One glimpse was enough to know it had cut deep. "You're not the only one who carries that kind of weight," he said softly, voice warm like old scars shown in sunlight. "I lost a dog, too. Maximum, a partner, during a sweep. I thought I was ready, but the order came too late. 1 minute late. That's all it took to change everything." For the first time in the dim morning light, two people quietly shared a pain that had no name, the kind of pain that couldn't be measured by wounds or time, only by how much it never left. And now, as Kara leaned against a wall of snow and Warren tightened the final bandage, they both understood. What they were saving wasn't just the four-legged lives by the fire. Shadow had already risen, silently approaching. The big dog sat behind Warren, saying nothing, making no move, just watching, as if he knew this human carried a wound too, one that no bandage could reach. Hope was still asleep. Echo stirred slightly, burrowing deeper into the blanket Warren had wrapped him in the night before. All three dogs seemed to sense that the humans around them, like themselves, were learning how to carry their losses, each breath, each scar etched with a story of sacrifice and hope. "It's strange," Kara sighed, eyes closed. "I always thought I was here to save them, but sometimes it feels like they're the ones keeping the best parts of me from disappearing." Warren looked at Shadow, then back to Kara. He knew that feeling well, because the moment he reached out for hope and Shadow in that first storm was the moment he realized he wasn't just surviving winter anymore. He was learning how to live again, for something warmer. "They never speak," he murmured, "but somehow they remind us who we used to be." Outside, the wind stirred again, but this time it didn't bring a killing chill. It whispered like a forest, waking as if the earth itself nodded at what had just been revealed. On the white snow, the three dogs lay still, breathing in rhythm with two people who once thought they had lost themselves, now finding their way back through silent, honest moments like this one. The temporary camp remained silent after a long night battling snow, wind, and anxiety. Beneath the frayed edge of the tent canvas, the early morning light filtered through tiny seams, as if afraid to wake the fragile lives breathing gently in the wan warmth of the deep forest. Warren opened his eyes, not because of a sound, but because something in the air had changed. The atmosphere felt gentler, softer, brighter, carrying something both strange and familiar that he hadn't yet named. He sat up, shoulders still sore, back aching from waking repeatedly to check the tarp, keep the fire going, and listen to Echo's breathing. But this morning, that breath was steadier, stronger, and woven into it was a sound so unexpected it made his heart skip a beat. A short bark, hoarse but full of strength, then another, sharp and sure, and then a third, smaller, thinner, yet ringing out like the final note of a harmony completed after a long, unfinished journey. Warren froze, eyes immediately locking onto three figures stirring near the fire. Shadow, the pack leader, stood watchful on the perimeter, ears tilted as if to confirm that it had indeed been the source of the first bark. Its ears perked, eyes lifted toward the edge of camp with a look that seemed to declare something sacred beyond any call. Beside it, Hope stretched her neck and let out a clear, short bark, tail softly tapping the blanket Warren had used the night before. Her eyes were brighter than they had been in days, no longer dulled by pain, but glowing with a radiance almost impossible for a creature that had just stared down death. And between the two bodies, Echo, the smallest, weakest pup, once trembling in Warren's arms, was now trying to stand on all fours. Every muscle quivered, each step still staggered, but her eyes stopped time. They weren't clouded by hunger, nor dulled by exhaustion, but clear, gleaming, mirroring the sky slowly breaking behind her. Those eyes held no fear, only resolve. Echo took a step, then paused. She didn't fall. Instead, she looked up at Warren. And then she barked, a fragile sound cracking through the frigid air. But to Warren, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Behind him, Kara had awakened. She leaned gently against the tent wall, her bandaged hand hanging limply as if afraid to disturb the moment. Her eyes shimmered. Dan and Nina were awake too, but no one spoke. They just stood there, silent, eyes fixed on the 3 barking dogs, not out of alarm or warning, but something more sacred, a declaration of life and reunion. Warren stepped forward slowly and sat down beside the fire they had kept burning all night. The 3 German shepherds turned toward him, no longer barking, but their eyes, 3 sets in 3 different shades, spoke the same silent language. "Thank you." He extended his hand. Hope came first, gently placing her snout in his palm, just like the first time they met in the cabin. Shadow quietly sat beside him, eyes never leaving Echo. And Echo, the smallest, most fragile, took another step, wobbled but didn't give up, and rested her chin on Warren's knee, whimpering like a child who had just found a heartbeat it knew by memory. He smiled, a small, tired smile, but whole. That moment, when all 3 animals who had endured isolation, hunger, and despair now barked into the dawn, said everything words never could. Kara whispered behind him, "They remember each other." Warren didn't reply. He knew. He felt it deeper than language. These weren't just 3 dogs. They were a family, pieced back together by trust, by hands without weapons, and by the warmth of a place they hadn't dared hope for. Far away, the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting its first rays across the snow. No more gloom, no more cold, only streaks of light, shimmer like Echo's eyes as she found her voice after the nightmare ended. As the first rays of sunlight slipped through the trees, casting a pale glow over the snow, Warren had already been awake for hours. He sat still beside the 3 dogs, listening to their steady breathing in rhythm with the soft crackle of the makeshift heater. Last night, Echo had slept deeper. Hope was no longer curled into herself, but stretched out, as if her small body had finally found peace after days of exhaustion. Shadow didn't take his eyes off his siblings, gaze still like stone, but lying closer than ever, radiating silent protection. An engine rumbled from beyond the hill, not loud, not urgent, but loud enough that all 3 dogs opened their eyes at once. Shadow stood first, his large frame casting a long shadow on the snow as he walked to the camp's edge. Hope lifted her head too, ears alert but calm. Echo remained still, eyes drowsy but tracking the sound. Kara stepped beside Warren, her voice soft. "They're here. The center's rescue team." Warren said nothing. He only inhaled deeply, hand gripping the corner of the blanket covering Echo. The warmth these dogs had brought in recent days hadn't just thawed his body. It had revived a part of his soul that had frozen the day Max was gone. Now, as he prepared to say goodbye, his chest felt hollow in a way he hadn't expected. The vehicle parked at the camp's edge. 2 rescuers emerged, Dan, a graying man with a kind face, and Nina, a young woman carrying a first aid kit and heat blankets. They worked efficiently but gently, every motion radiating understanding and care for these vulnerable creatures. Echo was lifted first, by Warren himself. The pup's tiny, light body made him shiver as he felt her faint heartbeat beneath matted fur. "She'll need fluids and close monitoring," Nina murmured as she took Echo into her arms. But Warren didn't let go right away. He lowered his forehead to hers, whispering as if to a child in a dream, "You're almost there. There's sunlight. Meadows. and life waiting for you. Hope came next. Though her front leg was still weak, she insisted on walking a few steps, as if clinging to some ancient wolf dignity in her blood. But when she reached Warren, she stopped, resting her head against his leg. He knelt, wrapped his arms around her, and buried his face in her fur. "Thank you for warming the cabin, for helping me believe again." Hope didn't bark, just a soft whimper, like a farewell not spoken in human language. Shadow was last. Kara reached out to call him, but before she could speak, he was already moving. With each step deliberate, he walked past everyone to the 2 crates where Echo and Hope had been placed. When he reached them, he gently lifted a paw onto Hope's crate. Their eyes met through the mesh, and even Dan fell silent. No howl, no bark, but in that fleeting instant, a bond was sealed tighter than ever. When Shadow was finally placed into the last crate, he didn't resist, but didn't lie down either. He sat, chin resting on the crossbar, eyes locked on his siblings. Kara looked at Warren, whispering, "They understand. They're not scared, just sad." The 3 crates were arranged close, so each dog could see the others. Kara lined the bottoms with warm blankets, and Warren, hands trembling, closed each crate door himself. His fingers shook as he latched the final lock. Shadow didn't whimper, didn't growl, just looked at him with the same eyes Warren had seen that first night in the cabin. Eyes that now seemed to say, "Thank you," or something deeper that no words could reach. The vehicle door shut. Warren placed his hand on the cold metal, holding it there for a few seconds. "Go on," he said. "But if one day the snow falls again, and you come back, this will still be home." The truck pulled away. Its wheels crushed the snow with a sound that caught in Warren's throat. Kara stood beside him, silent. Inside, the 3 dogs huddled close. Echo tucked herself into Hope's belly. Shadow turned, eyes still fixed on the rear door, on the man still standing there, unmoving, until the vehicle and its engine faded into the snowy forest. Then, only the wind remained, and the steady beat in Warren's chest, a heartbeat that no longer felt alone. The rescue truck disappeared behind the snow-laden pines, leaving behind tire tracks already beginning to fade beneath the wind. Warren remained motionless at the camp gate, eyes fixed on the pale, distant white. He could hear his heartbeat clearly, each thump like a final farewell to the 3 beings he never imagined would enter his life, only to quietly leave again, taking something deep and real with them. When the forest finally swallowed the last beam of the departing headlights, Warren turned and made his way back to the cabin. Each step on the snow crunched underfoot, as if reminding him of every morning spent checking firewood with the dogs, each evening by the fire sharing dried meat. Every night Hope panted softly beneath the worn blanket, or those quiet moments when Shadow rested his head on Warren's knee, needing no words at all. With every step back, those memories surfaced. Not loudly, but like embers buried in ash, glowing just enough to warm the soul in the heart of winter. The cabin emerged through a thin mist, its roof heavy with snow, smoke no longer curling from the chimney, yet it didn't feel abandoned. Unlike times before, this place now bore traces of life, however fleeting. Entering the cabin, Warren didn't turn on the lights. His eyes had adjusted to the dark, and his heart still held the afterglow of those 3 dogs. The thick gray blanket still lay neatly beside the fireplace, their gathering spot. Warren knelt, touched the worn threads. The faint scent of smoke clung to the fibers, making him close his eyes, imagining he could still hear Hope's soft breaths, Shadow's steady inhale as he slept, and Echo's occasional whimper in dreams. Sounds that were once foreign noise had become the soundtrack he missed most. He lit the fire, not for warmth, but out of habit. A habit the 4-legged guests had planted in him, like a memory that breathes. Sparks caught, and golden light danced across the wooden walls. Warren didn't make tea, didn't grab a book, didn't turn on the radio. He simply sat in the old leather chair, gazing through the foggy window. Beyond it lay the forest, the untouched snow. But now it no longer threatened him. He had once feared silence, but now that silence was not a chasm. It was a quiet promise that if another soul ever wandered here, he would open the door again. Beneath the window, the old water bowl still sat, the one Hope had drunk from her first day. He didn't put it away. It stayed as a symbol, a signal to any wandering spirit that 3 German shepherds had once taken shelter here, that this place had once been a refuge for the weary searching for warmth, and that it still was. Warren placed a hand over his chest, feeling a heartbeat that had once gone numb with loss now pulsing to a new rhythm. Soft, but full of life. He whispered, not sure to whom, perhaps Max, perhaps Echo, perhaps just to himself, "Next time I won't wait so long." In the heart of the cabin, the fire cracked gently, casting flickering shadows across the wooden wall, sketching shapes that looked like 3 dogs resting together. Warren stared at them, unable to look away. A faint howl echoed from far off, or maybe just the wind through the roof, but it was enough to make him smile. The cabin was the same, but the man inside was not. Late that afternoon, as the last light faded from the snowy pines, Warren sat in the small kitchen, holding a cup of coffee gone cold. The fire still glowed faintly in the hearth, offering a warmth that soothed more than just the body. It quietly kept pace with the emotions that, for so many years, he had buried deep beneath the shell of solitude. His phone lay still on the wooden table beside him, its dark screen mirroring the silence in his heart, since the day the 3 dogs left the snowbound camp. He wasn't expecting news. He didn't dare, because part of him feared that if there was nothing left to hope for, he would slip back into the emptiness of the years before. But then, like a quiet promise from somewhere far away, the phone buzzed gently. On the screen, Kara sent 3 photos. Warren didn't open them right away. He placed his hand above the screen, fingers hesitating in mid-air, like someone about to turn a page they weren't ready to reread. It took a long moment before he finally swiped. The first photo opened to reveal Hope, the smallest of the 3, running across a sunlit, snowy field. The white ground stretched endlessly, and her once skinny body had filled out again. Her hind leg was still bandaged but strong now, each stride flowing in time with nature's rhythm. A pale blue scarf fluttered around her neck, dancing in the wind like a dream. But what stopped Warren's eyes the longest was her gaze. Those same clear eyes, no longer weary. It was the look of a soul that had stepped out of the dark. He gently swiped to the second photo. Shadow lay peacefully under a tree, pine branches hanging down like a soft curtain of shade. His head rested on Echo's back, the youngest, the one Warren had found trembling at the edge of the forest. Echo was sleeping, breathing evenly, eyelids shut as if finally free from the fears that once haunted her. Both their coats were clean, shiny, and warm. No fences, no leashes, no alarms. Just the quiet presence of trust and peace. Warren touched the screen, his fingers trembling. Not from cold, but from emotion. Because he knew that to take this photo had required countless struggles, sleepless nights, and hearts that never gave up through the biting winter. The final photo made him pause the longest. All 3 dogs stood close together beside a wooden fence at the rescue center. Behind them, a crimson sunset burned across the sky, as if nature itself wanted to sing them a hymn for a new day. Hope leaned her head on Echo's shoulder, while Shadow stood between them. Tall, calm, his eyes looking straight into the camera, as if he were looking straight at Warren. A gaze with no words, but full of gratitude. Below the photo, Kara had written in slanted, careful handwriting, "A small family, reunited, safe, survived." Warren read it again, and again. The final word, "survived," made him pause, because it didn't just speak of the dogs who had escaped death. It spoke of him, too, the man who had survived the freezing years of his soul by doing something he never dared believe would be enough. He leaned back in the chair, gazing up at the familiar wooden ceiling of the cabin. On the small shelf near the fireplace still lay the old wool blanket, the one he had wrapped Hope in that first night. It was no longer a keepsake, it was proof. Another message appeared. "If you want, you can come visit. Echo can stand now. Shadow still sleeps near the door like he's guarding it. Hope? She goes out early every morning like she's looking for something." Warren read it, his throat tightening. Maybe Hope still remembered the small kitchen, the smell of roasting meat that night, or the sound of crackling wood during the storm. He typed a few words, then erased them. In the end, he simply sent, "I'll come." Outside, the sun had set, but inside the cabin, the warmth remained, not just from the fire, but from within his heart. That morning, as Warren stepped onto the familiar forest ground, once buried beneath snowstorms and darkness just a month ago, his heart stirred like a steady but urgent drumbeat. Kara had met him at the entrance to the wildlife sanctuary, saying nothing, just giving a small nod, as if to wordlessly signal that the moment had come, the moment he and the 3 dogs had braved countless long nights to finally reach. The sky was an unnaturally clear blue. Sunlight poured across the now thawed earth, revealing soft, damp brown soil that smelled faintly of returning life. Birds sang somewhere in the distance, and the towering pines stood still, as if listening, too. The gate to the semi-wild rehabilitation zone opened into a valley. Nature preserved but bounded for animals in recovery. There, the wooden crates stood with their mesh doors removed. No locks, no barriers. Warren stood on a gentle slope, looking down at the 3 boxes where Shadow, Hope, and Echo were waiting. Echo was the first to step out, slowly but without hesitation. Her back was stronger now, her fur sleek again, and her amber eyes no longer carried confusion. She didn't scan the woods out of fear, but as if searching for something familiar. Then, suddenly she lifted her head and barked, a single, short sound that echoed across the hill. It wasn't loud, but it was pure and full of life, a signal that she was ready. Right behind her, Hope emerged, still limping slightly on the once-injured hind leg, but holding her chest high with confidence. She didn't look at the forest or the sky. She turned directly to Warren, standing on the hill. Her tail wagged, not vigorously in excitement, but gently, like a farewell, like a thank you only he could understand. At that moment, Warren no longer saw a rescue case. He saw a proud spirit stepping into the light, carrying both her scars and the will to overcome them. Finally, Shadow. As silent as the first time he had appeared at Warren's cabin door in the snow. He didn't rush. Each step onto the earth left a firm print. Then, as if time paused, Shadow stopped in a shaft of sunlight. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't flinch. He simply turned his head. His eyes locked onto Warren's, long, deep, unwavering. In that gaze was recognition, trust, and something profoundly human. As if to say, "You did the right thing. You kept your promise." Warren couldn't hold it anymore. Hot tears spilled from his reddened eyes, falling silently onto his worn coat. He didn't hide it, wasn't ashamed, didn't bow his head, because what he felt was not loss. It was release. Release from the guilt over Max. Release from the belief that he had nothing left to love. Kara placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed gently. "They'll be okay," she whispered. Warren nodded, never taking his eyes off the 3 figures fading into the green. Shadow led the way, walking slowly and surely. Echo trotted behind, now able to run on all 4 legs. Hope lagged for a moment, then suddenly leaped forward so she wouldn't be left behind. The 3 of them disappeared into the forest like a breeze, leaving only paw prints behind on the damp earth. Prints of survivors. Prints of a family reborn in the cold. Warren stood there for a long, long time, as if trying to hold on to that final moment deep in a place he once thought had nothing left to give. When the last pines closed behind the three fading shapes, Warren remained still on the hillside, as if waiting for something unnamed. But in that quiet forest, under a sunset-tinged sky, he understood it was time to go home. Not to sorrow or loneliness, but to a heart that had been changed. On the trail back to the cabin, the once thick snow had thinned to faint patches under the late-season sun. Warren walked slowly, brushing his hand across the old carvings on the tree trunks. Marks from past winters, years he had lived alone, denying everything he'd lost. But this time, at the cabin threshold, he didn't feel alone. Instead, he felt peace, a silence not from absence, but from a deep gratitude for what had been. The cabin was unchanged. Weathered wood, frosted windows, and the faint smoke scent still clinging to the hearth. But the space felt different. On the table sat a printed photo Kara had sent. The three dogs lying together in the shade, Echo holding a pine branch, Shadow resting his chin on Hope's back. Beneath the picture, a scribbled caption read, "A small family, free and loved." Day by day, Warren kept his old routines, chopping wood, keeping the house warm, cooking simple meals. But new things had quietly made their way into his life. He began writing to nearby rescue shelters, asking what they needed. When snow fell deep again, he drove down the mountain with blankets, antiseptics, or simply words of encouragement. Sometimes Kara would visit, not for duty, but just to sit by the fire and talk about the animals still waiting for a fresh start. Warren never spoke much about Shadow, Hope, or Echo, but anyone who sat in his cabin could tell. In the corner, there was always a clean blanket folded neatly, a bowl of water near the stove, and a dish of frozen meat, ready to be warmed in minutes. He wasn't waiting for anything in particular. He wasn't hoping to relive the past. But deep down, he was ready for any soul, animal, or human who might one day knock in the dead of winter. Because now he understood. Every encounter happens for a reason. Whether it's a trembling knock in a blizzard, or the quiet gaze of a dog who had lost all trust, any of it could be the start of something miraculous. Warren had once believed Max was the final chapter of his story, but Shadow, Hope, and Echo had shown him that beauty can begin again if we're brave enough to open the door once more. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls through the cracks and the moon hangs silently over the ridge, Warren keeps the fire burning low in the stove, just in case someone out there, lost and wandering, might need to see that warmth is still here. A cabin, a man who once lost everything, and a door, always open, always waiting. Because, as he once whispered to Echo on a snowbound night, there will always be someone waiting for you to come home. The story of Warren, Shadow, Hope, and Echo isn't just about surviving winter. It's a quiet testimony to something simple yet profound, that love, whether from human or animal, can heal even the oldest wounds, of body, of soul. A door opened in the dead of night, a trusting look, a gentle head resting on a knee, any of these can change a life. Have you ever felt that moment? When an animal's gaze stopped you in your tracks, when a small act cracked open your heart again? Share your story in the comments. Sometimes, it's the smallest things that move an entire community. If this story made you smile, cry, or simply feel a little warmer, like, share, and subscribe to join us for more journeys like this. Because maybe, just maybe, the door you open next will be the start of your miracle.